The United States military has 534 THAAD interceptors in its entire arsenal. That figure comes from the Missile Defense Agency's inventory as of December 2025, cited by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In its assessment published before Operation Epic Fury began, 534. That is not a daily resupply figure. That is the total. Every THAAD interceptor the United States owns anywhere in the world for any contingency against any threat. And a CENTCOM memorandum obtained by Politico and reported on March 6, 2026, states that the Pentagon is requesting military intelligence officers to support operations against Iran for at least 100 days, but likely through September. 100 days. 534 interceptors. Those two numbers have not appeared in the same sentence in any major coverage of this conflict. They need to be. To understand why that gap matters, you have to start not with the intercept rates the briefings are highlighting, but with what the June 2025 12-day conflict already consumed before Operation Epic Fury began. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published its assessment of American interceptor expenditure during the June 2025 12-day operation. The figures it documented are the baseline for understanding what the current campaign is drawing down. During those 12 days, the United States likely used between 100 and 150 THAAD interceptors and approximately 80 SM-3s in support of Israel. The CSIS assessment was direct about what that figure represents. More than 150 THAAD interceptors would equate to roughly 30% of the total THAAD stockpile. 30% in 12 days, against an Iran that, according to Iran Watch, published by the Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control, possessed an estimated 1,500 missiles and 200 launchers at the end of that conflict. That was June 2025. Operation Epic Fury began February 28, 2026. The stockpile that absorbed a 12-day conflict 8 months ago is the same stockpile now entering a campaign whose own planning documents project a minimum of 100 days. Kelly Grieco, senior fellow at the Stimson Center, told Military Times on March 6, 2026, yesterday, the sentence that frames everything that follows. She said, and these are her exact words, "You can't replace those kinds of missiles overnight. It would take years. The interceptor is not a consumable that restocks between campaigns. It is a precision-manufactured system that takes years to produce and years to replace. The production line cannot be surged the way ammunition can." Lockheed Martin, which produces the PAC-3 Patriot interceptor, and Raytheon, which produces THAAD, have been under contract to accelerate production since 2022. The acceleration is real. It is also measured in annual increments, not monthly ones. What the June 2025 conflict spent cannot be fully replaced before the conflict that began February 28, 2026, is spending more. Understanding why requires a brief look at what actually goes into manufacturing a THAAD interceptor. The kill vehicle, the component that physically collides with and destroys an incoming ballistic missile in the terminal phase, contains seeker systems, guidance electronics, and structural components that are manufactured by a small number of specialized suppliers. There is no commodity market for these parts. There is no surge capacity sitting idle waiting for a wartime demand signal. The production bottleneck is not final assembly. It is the supply chain phenomenon for the components that make the interceptor capable of hitting a maneuvering ballistic missile at high altitude. Army Recognition Group, in its February 2026 assessment of American missile defense industrial capacity, noted that the United States had announced plans to quadruple production of PAC-3, THAAD, and Tomahawk missiles following the June 2025 conflict. Quadrupling production from a baseline measured in dozens of units per month still produces dozens of units per month at an accelerated rate. It does not produce the hundreds of units per engagement that a sustained high-tempo conflict consumes. The gap between production rate and consumption rate is the strategic vulnerability that the 534 THAAD figure represents, and it is the vulnerability that Iran's operational planners have had years to study. Military Times ran the calculation on March 6th. If the United States uses interceptors during Operation Epic Fury at the same rate it did during the 12-day conflict, it would exhaust half of its entire interceptor stockpile in 4 to 5 weeks. Half. In 4 to 5 weeks. Against a campaign planned for 100 days minimum. That is the number that the 90% missile suppression figure does not contain. The 90% reduction in Iranian ballistic missile attacks is a real operational result, confirmed by CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper at MacDill Air Force Base on March 5, 2026. It reflects genuine degradation of Iran's above-ground launch infrastructure. But the 90% figure measures outgoing fire from Iran. The interceptor question measures the capacity to defend against what gets through. And here's the distinction that the Hudson Institute, his senior fellow Ken Kasapoglu, documented in his assessment published March 3, 2026. Kasapoglu analyzed the Gulf Arab states' interceptor situation alongside the American one. His finding was specific. The UAE, he assessed, may have already exhausted roughly 20 to 40% of its missile defense magazine depth in its effort to maintain interception rates above 90% against Iranian attacks through the first days of the conflict. As of March 3rd, Iran had targeted Kuwait alone with 178 ballistic missiles and 384 drones. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain had all faced attacks. Kasapoglu's assessment stated the consequence directly. If the depth of the Gulf Arab states' air and missile defenses runs low, those nations may be forced to ration interceptors or prioritize specific areas, just as Ukraine has in its conflict with Russia. Ukraine rationing air defenses is not an abstraction. It is a documented operational reality in which cities and infrastructure absorb strikes that the defense system has chosen not to expend interceptors to stop because the magazine cannot sustain unlimited engagement. That calculus, which strikes to intercept and which to accept, is what magazine exhaustion looks like in practice. And it is the calculus that the Hudson Institute is now applying to the Gulf. The Ukraine precedent deserves more attention than it has received in the context of this conflict. By late 2024, Ukraine's air defense operators had developed what Western military analysts described as triage protocols, internal prioritization frameworks that allocated interceptors to protect power generation infrastructure, military command nodes, and dense population centers, while accepting higher risk to secondary industrial targets and less critical infrastructure. The framework was not a failure of the defense system. It was a rational response to a finite magazine facing an adversary with a larger offensive inventory. The Patriot batteries that Ukraine received from the United States and Germany were not unlimited resources. They were carefully managed ones. And the management decisions they required, which incoming missile is worth a $4 million interceptor and which is not, are exactly the decisions that Gulf Arab state air defense commanders are now being asked to make at a tempo Ukraine never faced in a single week. Iran targeted Kuwait alone with 178 ballistic missiles and 384 drones in the first days of Operation Epic Fury. Ukraine, in its worst weeks, faced comparable numbers across an entire month. The Gulf is being asked to absorb in days what took Ukraine weeks. The magazine math runs faster here. There's a second layer to this problem that almost no coverage has addressed. The interceptor math is not symmetric. Iran fires a THAAD series drone that costs, by most open source estimates, between $20,000 and $50,000 to produce. The United States fires a PAC-3 interceptor that costs approximately $4 million per round. The Stimson Center's Grieco noted this directly in her Military Times interview. Each Shahed drone Iran launches costs Iran a fraction of what a Patriot interceptor costs the United States to fire in response. That cost asymmetry, compounded over days and weeks of sustained operations at the tempo this conflict has already demonstrated, is not a theoretical concern. It is the operational constraint that shapes every decision about what to intercept and what to absorb. The War Zone reported on March 1, 2026, that interceptor stocks are not in a good place, noting there is currently a race of attrition when it comes to the supply of missiles and counter-missile capabilities. That framing, a race of attrition, is the precise strategic description of what magazine depth exhaustion produces when one side can manufacture cheap offensive systems faster than the other side can manufacture expensive defensive ones. Iran understands this arithmetic. Dr. Sanam Vakil, director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House, told an Atlantic Council roundtable on March 6, 2026, that on day 6, it looks like Iran's capability to launch missiles is maybe reduced, but it could also be deliberate. Vakil said Iran is prepared for a longer conflict than the United States has planned for. The deliberate reduction in launch tempo is consistent with a strategy of preserving offensive inventory while the defense absorbs the cost of interception at a rate the magazine cannot sustain indefinitely. Mohammed Soliman, senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, put the strategic question to Military Times on March 6th in a single sentence. The question, he said, is which clock will run first. That is the question the interceptor inventory math is trying to answer. Watch 3 things in the coming 72 hours that will tell you whether the magazine depth problem is being managed or whether it is beginning to constrain operational decisions in ways the official briefings are not yet acknowledging. Watch whether CENTCOM or Pentagon briefings begin addressing interceptor inventory directly. Secretary Hegseth stated on March 5th that the United States has no shortage of ammunition and can continue operations for a long time. That statement covered offensive munitions. It did not address defensive interceptor inventory. If a future briefing specifically addresses THAAD and PS3 stocks, or specifically avoids the question when asked, both answers are informative. Watch whether the UAE or Saudi Arabia begin publicly requesting emergency interceptor transfers. The United States approved an emergency transfer of 12,000 BLU-110 bombs to sustain offensive strike capacity, reported by Army Recognition Group on March 6, 2026. An equivalent emergency request for defensive interceptors from a Gulf partner would signal that the magazine depth calculation Kasapoglu documented on March 3rd has moved from projected constraint to operational reality. And watch the Shahed drone intercept rates across Gulf partner air defenses. The Hudson Institute's assessment found Gulf states were maintaining above 90% interception rates as of March 3rd, while exhausting 20 to 40% of their magazine depth. If published intercept rate data from Saudi or UAE defense ministries begins to decline, if the percentage of drones reaching targets begins to rise, that is the operational signature of magazine rationing, before it is acknowledged in any official statement. The 90% offensive suppression is real. So is the 534 THAAD figure. So is the 100-day planning horizon. So is Kelly Grieco's assessment that replacement takes years, not months. All of those facts belong in the same analysis. The question this conflict will answer is not whether American offensive power can suppress Iranian launch rates. It already has. The question is whether the defensive magazine can sustain the suppression of what gets through across a campaign plan to last until September. Which clock runs first is not a rhetorical question. It is the operational question that the CENTCOM memorandum obtained by Politico on March 6, 2026, has now placed on the record.